Hi again. So we're going to continue along with our story from Sideways Stories from Wayside School. So we're about to read chapter 3. So if you're just joining us, you should probably go back and watch the first two videos of chapter 1 and 2. Remember that as we read along, feel free to doodle or write down some different ideas about what you think is unexpected or expected about the story. What I've done is I've made a little table on my piece of paper with a couple of different doodles from what I think was very unexpected about this classroom. And then I wrote what I think should have happened instead, or what would have been expected in a normal classroom. So for the last chapter, I have the number 3 here, and the number 3 is showing the kids waited 3 days before they told anybody about the fact that Mrs. Gorf was gone. And I think it would have been really expected that they told somebody right away that Mrs. Gorf was not teaching there anymore. I also drew a monkey to show that it was really unexpected that our new teacher was calling all the kids monkeys for a really long time when she first joined them, and that she wasn't expecting that they were kids. So it would have been way more expected had she come in and talked to them like they were kids. So as we go, feel free to doodle along with what's unexpected and expected with this story. So this is chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called Joe. And there's the picture of Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you are going to have to learn to count," said Mrs. Jules. "But Mrs. Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First count to 10, said Mrs. Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 3, 11, 10. "No, Joe, that's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you were wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have here, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" asked Joe. 5, said Mrs. Jules. "That's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You are just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jules." "No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jules. "But that's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." 1,000, 1,000,000, 3, said Joe. "Correct," said Mrs. Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "May I have a potato?" asked Joe. "No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jules. "Now you say it." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. "Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you." Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "There are 10, Mrs. Jules." "No," said Mrs. Jules. "Didn't I count right?" asked Joe. "Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer," said Mrs. Jules. This doesn't make any sense, said Joe. When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer. When I count the right way, I get the wrong answer. Mrs. Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. How many times did I hit my head against the wall? She asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jules. 4, 6, 1, 5, 9. Oops. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head against the wall 5 times, said Joe. Mrs. Jules shook her head no and said, yes, that's right. The bell rang and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had done them very good, and they were excited and laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. Now I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where were you? Asked John. You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What's wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Miss Jules was just trying to teach me how to count. You mean you don't know how to count? Joy laughed. Counting is easy, said Marisha. Now, said Mrs. Jules. What's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Marisha. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jules. She wrote Marisha's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. I just don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jules. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly be able to count. Joe asked, if all I have to do to wake up, why am I coming to school? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jules. Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count. By that time, I'll have no hair on top of my head left to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Miss Jules. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. And that's the end of chapter 3. So I'll be curious to see what kinds of doodles and pictures you're sending me of what you think was expected and what was unexpected from this chapter. See you later.